Next.js App Router is now in a stable spot. It's been officially released out of beta, and I thought it's the greatest time to start talking about authentication in App Router. How does that work with server components, and how you can use Clerk to make that happen. So the first thing we want to do is create our new application. So we can just do npx create next app, and we'll do at latest, and then we'll call this Clerk with App Router. Now that's done, let's start answer all the questions. We'll do TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind. We'll do it in the source directory. Obviously, we want App Router. We will do import aliases just for fun, and we'll just leave those as @/. While that's happening, let's head over to clerk.com, and we'll make a dashboard here. Of course, I'm already logged in, and so we'll just switch to my personal workspace, and we'll create a new application here, and we'll call it Clerk with App Router. Really long name. We'll zoom in a bit. We'll select Google, and maybe we'll just put on GitHub because it's one of my favorites. We'll hit create application, and now we should be ready to go. So at this point, this is the dashboard. If you've never seen it before, let me just quickly go over it. So this is where all your users would be when they sign up. If you're using organizations, if you've got it enabled, it would also be here. In your user and authentication, this is where you choose what kind of authentication you want, what kind of restrictions, do you want MFA, any of those kinds of things, plus all the social providers that Clerk provides. Then in your org settings, this is globalized. So for organizations, at any point, if you enable it here, you can set all the settings right here. For sessions, this is your session lifetime. This is the lifetime cookie, not the short-term session that you would see as a user, but how long it would last before the user has to log in again. So right now it's set to 7 days, which is just the normal one. And then you can customize your session tokens. In here is some customization stuff, such as avatars, which allows you to make custom ones for people that don't have anything. Then you have your integrations, which is just Firebase and Analytics right now. But if you go to JWTs, which is our actual integrations, you can integrate with Supabase, nHost, GraphBase, Convex, Azure, and Fauna. Then if you need webhooks for any reason, you can enable them right here. If you're looking for your API keys at any point, right under API keys. And then plan and billing, obviously that makes sense. And then for settings in here, you can transfer this to an organization if you create one in the future. Okay, so by now everything should be ready to go. So let's go ahead and copy these keys, and then let's head over to our terminal. So it's finished creating, so we can go to cd clerk with app router. Then we can just install the Clerk package, npm install @clerk/next.js. And we'll do at latest to make sure that we have the latest version. That'll install up, and then we'll open this in our favorite IDE, which happens to be Z for me. And if you haven't already seen the video, check it out. YZ is still good 3 months later. Okay, so now we have our project here. First thing we want to do is create this .env. So just do .env and paste those 2 keys in and hit save. Those are the only 2 keys you're going to need for this entire process. While I'm here, actually, let's just move me from here to here. That makes more sense. And then we'll make this full screen so that there's no bars at the bottom. And we're good to go. So from here, we just need to start using Clerk. So the first thing we want to do is actually wrap our entire root layout, which is found under app layout. And we want to import Clerk provider from Next.js. And we're just going to wrap our entire body here in our Clerk provider. So what this allows us to do is have access to both the auth state and the sessions throughout your entire application. This doesn't make your application client only. This is a server component. So by default, the root layout has to be a server component. So there's nothing for you to do here. Just wrap it right up, and that's it for now. Now we have that, we want to implement middleware. Now middleware needs to go into source, and inside of that will be your middleware.ts. Now, if you're not using the source directory, which some people aren't, it just needs to be at the root of your project, not inside the app, just inside the root. So source becomes the root if you're using it. So now we have this, we're actually just going to head over to the Clerk docs because it's easier for me to copy them than it is for me to type this all out. So if you go to clerk.com/docs, there's a Next.js section right here. Click the Getting Started, scroll down, and you'll see there's this Protect Your Application section. Go ahead and copy this and drop it right into your application. Hit save. Now, by default, every single page on your application, including API routes, are protected by Clerk. So if you don't want that and there's specific routes that you want to be public, you can extend this out. There is a section called Public Routes. So let's say we want / to be a public route. Now, anything that's on the home page would be a public route if you're doing a landing page. Similarly, if you want your API routes here, which is another new one here, you can put in all of your API routes, so like /API, for example. And what that does is tell us that these are all your API routes. So they're still protected, but it tells us, hey, don't show the login page. Instead, show the user of 401, and we'll use this a bit later and I'll show it off. But for now, I want to protect every single page. So from here, what we can do now is, in theory, just go ahead and start using our application. This, by default, will use our hosted pages. So if I go in here and say import user button, and we toss the user button somewhere in this main section, let's just delete this all out for now, as we'll be filling in with lots of different information as this video goes on. So if we throw a user button in here, and we hit save, in theory, what will happen now is when we launch this application, it will go to the hosted pages for Clerk, allow the user to sign in, redirect them back to localhost 3000, and they'll see the user button. So let's give that a whirl first. So from here, I'll just tab into Warp, do npm run dev. As you can see, localhost is launched. Let's go ahead and open that in a full window, and let's just see what happens. So as you can see right now, we are now loaded into this. Clerk is in development mode. This is a hosted page. So this is not your local host. This is hosted for Clerk. So if I zoom in a bit so we can see what's happening, let's go ahead and just go ahead and log in with our GitHub account. It's going to ask you if you want to give access to the user profile and email address by default, and these are only read-onlys. So we click authorize and we get redirected back to our application. And inside of our application, once it gets redirected, we'll see a user button here, which we can see on screen, and I can zoom in a bit more here. Here's 175. Click this button. I can now manage my account as a user. I can do whatever I need to, and we now have authentication. My problem with authentication on hosted pages is not quite as exciting as mounting your own components and controlling everything inside of it. So let's work on that now. So let's sign out here. I'll get redirected back to the development page, but let's go ahead and start working on this. So inside of your app directory, you're going to create two different places, one called sign in and one called sign up. And we can talk about the differences in a second. It may seem obvious, but there are some things here that need to be cleared up. So let's create a folder here. We'll call it sign in. Then inside of this sign in, we're going to create an optional catch-all route, which in app directory is slightly different than it used to be for pages router. So for app router is going to be 2 square braces, ... then the folder name again. So we can do sign in. And then inside of that folder, you're going to just create your page. So you can just go page.tsx. Then we can import the sign in page. So just sign in. And that comes from next.js. And then we can just export default function, sign in page, and we can actually delete all of this out, and we can just have it look like this. So this is, again, another server component. It is not a client component, so you can use this as part of RSC. This allows you as a user to be able to essentially use server components instead of client ones. And again, we can just create another page exactly the same as this one, but for sign up. So we can just do sign up. And inside of that, we'll create another catch-all folder, which is just 2 square braces, ... the folder directory, and then another set of square braces. And then inside of that, we can create our page.tsx. And again, we can just go back to our sign-in page here and drop this one in, change this to sign up, give it a sign up page so that we know what page we're on. And then we can just change this out. Now we need to tell Clerk, hey, by the way, this is where our sign up and sign in pages are. And also tell it where we want it to go by default. Now that isn't a requirement, but it makes it easier if you just have two routes, right? So like maybe you have an onboarding, you can send sign up to /onboarding, and for sign in, you can just send it to /home. But for ours, we're just going to keep them the same. So inside of our env here, clerk, sign in URL, and we can just set that to /sign in, and we can just copy this down, and we can set this to sign up. And this is all in our documentation, but it's just important that we cover it while we're here. And then we also have next public clerk after sign in URL. So we'll just set that to /. And then we also have a separate one for sign up, but we're also going to set it to / for now. Now, what this does is it tells middleware, hey, by the way, if a user is not authenticated, send them to this route, and we'll detect what your original route is. So if you're coming from localhost, we'll detect that. If you're coming from james'scoolwebsite.com, we'll detect that as well, and we'll redirect the user to the correct place. So now we have all of that figured out. We can go back to our terminal, and we can just restart the server. Then we can go back to our page here. This is going to be localhost 3000. And the thing you'll notice immediately is instead of being redirected here, we'll actually get redirected to the home page, which you can see this is very different. Also, I don't know how to spell because that doesn't say clerk. But now you can see that this is very different. It's off to the left. It's on a black screen, and you're not really sure what you're doing here and why is it not centered. And that's because with Clerk, we let you do whatever you want. So you could just put some CSS in there to center it in the middle. So let's talk about how sign in and sign up works with Clerk. So if you click sign in here and you select, say, continue with Google, and you don't have an account. So if I click this and I select my, my personal account here, you notice that I actually get signed in anyway. Like here I am, and I've been signed in, even though I didn't have an account. And now if I sign out and we go back to the sign in page, and we go back to the sign in page and I type in my email here, it will let me log in. As you can see, it sent me a verification code. That's because Clerk gives you the ability to account links. So if you sign up with your email first, for example, james@jamesperkins.dev, and then you forget that you signed up with that, and then you click the Google button and it happens to be the same email, we'll automatically log you in and say, yep, that's fine. You own that account. You can log in. Similar vein, if you don't have an account and you click Google, we'll sign you up and give you your account immediately versus you being rejected and saying, hey, you need to sign up first before you can sign in. The only time that this is not true is if you go to an email address that doesn't exist. So for example, james@clerk.dev. If I click continue here, it's going to tell you you couldn't find your account, and then you're going to have to go and sign up. In the future, we'll have a unified one of these, so it doesn't really matter. But right now, that's just how it works. But we automatically account link. Okay, so now we've mounted our components here. We can sign in for ourselves, and we're using our own local host to handle all of that. So this user button is a server component as well. So there's no use client here. And now we should talk about accessing user auth data or user data on the server side. And then we can talk about how you can protect route handlers, how you can do server actions, both on the client and on the server. And then that will basically be everything in this tutorial. Let's talk about accessing auth data and user data on the server. So for example, if you do import auth from next.js, and Zed's going to double import because it does every time, you now have access to auth data, which is just lightweight and uses the JWT to give you the information. So inside of here is all the auth data you could possibly need. So if I do auth and I look inside of here, we have all of these different things that we can choose from. So we can have the actor if you're using user impersonation. You can enable debug to see what's happening. There's this thing called get token, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Org ID, org slug, and org role. Those are all attached to the current active organization. There's session claims and session ID here, which are both related to your session token. And then finally, we have this user ID. You will notice there is user, session, and org And currently those do not provide any data. They will always be undefined by default. This is just a side effect of some other things. So the most important thing here is probably user ID. And that user ID allows you to handle certain scenarios. So we could say if there's a user ID, we can do something else. If not, there we go. I don't know what this does. We'll just print this out. And then we'll go back to our application, and you can see down here, welcome to Clerk plus Next.js starter. You're logged in, and that's all based upon this request right here. In some cases, you may need more user data for some reason. Now, there is a current user. So with current user, it is an asynchronous request. So you are going to have to use an await here. So we can just do const user equals await current user. And obviously this is going to complain because await is only allowed here. So we can make this asynchronous, and that should, and then if we hit save here, we can now console log out this user instead. So we can say console log user, and we can say if there's a user, let's say you're logged in, and then maybe we'll just do user.firstname. And as you can see, it says, welcome to Next.js. You're logged in, James. That's me, definitely my first name. And we can even check this by clicking this manage account and seeing that my first name is indeed James and my last name is P. And you can see that my GitHub is indeed connected to my account. So now we've talked about auth and current user, but we should talk about the dangers of using current user all the time. So if you're using current user, it should only be used very sparingly. And the reason that is because this is actually rate limited because it uses the Clerk's API to go and fetch the current user from the backend using server versus the auth here, which isn't rate limited because it just decodes the JWT. But now you're probably wondering, well, how do I get the data that I might need to use all the time? Things like public metadata, or maybe my first and last name is always required and I need it on every page and it must be up to date. Or maybe you want your email address, or maybe it's just some other random piece of information. And that's where session token customization comes in. So let's talk about that really quick. So if you go to your Clerk dashboard and you go underneath your sessions here, and then you scroll down, there's this thing called Customize Session Token right here. If you click Edit, it's going to load in this screen here, and you can add custom claims to your session token, which makes them available all the time. So in here, we could just say full name, and we can set that equal to user.fullname. And we'll also do email, because maybe you need the email for some reason. Maybe you have some sort of Stripe stuff. And then finally, we'll do user's image. So maybe just profile image. And we'll set that finally to user.image URL. And we'll make sure we put a comma here. And now if I hit save here, now my session token has been updated with this information. So if we go back to our code here and we delete out this current user stuff, so now we don't want this anymore. And we do const, and then auth. Inside of auth here, we're going to have a bunch of stuff, right? And one of them was called session claims, which is right here. And we'll also grab the user ID as well, just to be sure. And inside of this sessions claim is going to be all those details that I talked about. So let's put if user ID here, and then we'll do session claims dot full name. And that should give us our full name for session claims. So if I hit save here, we can also just do console log session claims so you can see what's inside of them. Hit save, go back to our create next app here. And as you can see here, it says you're logged in, James P. And if I go to our Warp terminal here, here are the session claims that we have. So you can see inside of here, my email address is available. My profile image is also available. And of course, the full name. So you can access that right through the token, zero latency versus current user where we actually have to wait that for it to come down. So you can use this to fill in any of those gaps. If you're building roles for B2C stuff and you're not using organizations, put them in your public metadata, put your public metadata right in your session token, and then you have the roles whenever you need them without any additional API requests. So now we've talked about that part, let's talk about the juicy parts of App Router. With App Router came two new things, or really one new thing, which is server actions, but really route handlers, I suppose, are classed as new because it's a new way to do APIs. And with Clerk, you can use them without any additional work. So let's start working on route handlers now. One of the new features of App Router, which is that we've moved away from API routes, and now we're using this thing called route handler, which allows you to put your routes literally anywhere in your application, but for traditional sake, we'll put them in our API folder just so that you can see how they work. So if we go back here and we go back to our project, we create a new folder, we'll call it APIs, or in this case, API, called route.ts. Now we have a route handler that we can use to test how Clerk works and show you how you, one, can protect them, and two, we can talk about how API routes work. So first things first, let's go ahead and grab a route handler from next.js. We'll just grab anyone just so we have a nice starting point. Let's just grab this one, paste it in here, and then let's delete everything out that's inside of here. So first thing just to show off is that the same things apply here. So import current user, and we can also use auth here. But let's start with current user. Just like before, you can do const user equals await current user. We don't need any request in here. We'll just handle it as needed. And then we can just return this as our JSON. So if we hit save here, we go back to our application that we're logged into. And we go to localhost 3000 and we just do API, which would be where the route is. You can see here is the full user object and it's been returned. And you can use that however you want. Of course, use sparingly, it is rate limited. So what if you just wanted to protect this route and make sure that a user is logged in? So for example, we could do const user ID equals auth. So now we have the user ID. We can say if no user ID return, you know what, we'll just return this, but we'll just return it empty for now. And then if there is one, we'll just return user ID and we'll hit save. Okay, so if we go back here and we do a refresh, user ID is this. So there we go. So now we have a user ID, but if we go ahead and sign out, that might not be the case. So first things first, I actually want to fix something here. Part of this user button by default will redirect you to hosted pages. So there is an after sign out URL. We'll just set that to / and that will redirect us back to the sign in page. But you could obviously just set this to sign in if you so wish. So now we've done that. If I go back to our regular page here and just go to the localhost, which is our / page, and we just go ahead, click this button and click sign out. Okay, we're signed out. Everything's super zoomed in because I went a bit crazy with the zoom button. Okay, now let's go and hit that API route and let's see what happens by default. So if we go to localhost 3000 / API, yeah, that was just for dramatic pause. As you can see, nothing has happened. What's actually happened is in the URL bar here, we've actually been redirected back to localhost / API. And that's just by default, middleware protects all routes. And if you don't tell it that there is either a API needs to be completely public or you're using the API routes, by default, you'll just get redirected to the sign-in page, which is not ideal if you're using API routes. So if we go here and we just set our API route, so if we say API routes and we just say / API, we'll get a different experience here. If we do **, that should give us anything that lives in API will be part of this API routes. So if we go back here now and I try again, we should get a different experience. Just says null. And if we open our network request, which is probably easier to look at, If we do a refresh now, you'll see that this status is set to 401 and unauthorized. So if you just want us to handle that by default and just say, hey, if you're not logged in and I don't want to have to deal with like checking whether or not the user ID exists or not, I can just do API routes, ignore them, 401 unauthed. So that works by default. But in some cases, you want fine-grained control over your API routes, and that is perfectly okay. So if we put public routes here and we set it to this slash API, just as we did here, and we delete this out, and we'll delete out this public route because we want everything to be detected. What will happen now is we'll get a different experience. So if I refresh now, we get a 200 and we get an empty object, which is what my route handler was originally set to, right? So if there's no user ID, obviously, if you wanted to, you could do a return like new response, unauthorized access detected, status 401 yourself. So here we go. And if I go back to our application here and I do a refresh, now we get unauthorized access detected. We still get a 401 over here. So you could handle this all yourself, or you could just let Clerk do it. So that's how route handlers work, and also how middleware works with both public routing and, of course, handling APIs yourself using our API routes. Next, we should talk about server actions, which is the new feature included in App Router that is still currently in beta or alpha beta or somewhere in that region. And it has multiple ways that you can use it. So you can use a server action right in a server component, no problems there. And then you obviously have a way to use a server component with a client, and all of that is possible. However, there are some caveats here. So let's talk about server actions. So we're going to create another folder in here. We're just going to call it _actions. Inside of that, we're going to create all of our actions, and we're going to use one straight in here first, and then we'll use one in a different place. So first, let's head over to this documentation here and look at server actions, which I actually don't know where they live right now. Server actions. Okay, they're in an alpha state right now. I knew they were in something. Let's go ahead and grab this right now. So let's just copy. So let's use this server action. Let's just go ahead and delete everything out on our page. Now we have this add to cart. It's just a form with a button and it says add to cart. First thing we want to do is delete this cookies out. We don't need that. We can import auth, for example. We'll use that. That's probably the best option for this example. And we can say inside of here is your server action. If you've never used them before, it's okay, but just imagine this is your server action. First thing we can do is check to see if there's a user ID. So we can just do const user ID equals auth. If no user ID, we can just do nothing. We can throw an error message. And then if we do have a user ID, just for this example, we'll just do console.log and we'll just say adding product ID to user ID, just like this. We can hit save here, and that would be everything that we need to make this in theory work. But what I'm going to do here is I'm actually just going to delete this product ID out from here. There is data here, but what we'll do is we'll just create a product ID. We'll just call it const product ID equals, and we'll just set this to 1000, and we can delete this data out too, and we can hit save. Okay, so here we have a very simple add to cart. What we're doing here is making sure that there is a user ID. If there is no ID, we're going to throw this. Otherwise, we can do this. Now, in theory, this would never work, except from it is on a public route. So what we can do here is first, let's just test to make sure this works. So if we just go to localhost 3000, and then what we should see is this error message, which I completely forgot about, which is that we need to add this to our next config. So inside of here, we need to do experimental. And inside of that, there should be server actions. And we just set this to true, hit save, and then we restart our server. So I don't think that's hot loaded, but if it is, okay, so now we've loaded back in, we can just go ahead and sign back into our application. I'll just sign in with another random account. So now that we're logged in, if we click the add to cart button, nothing really happens here. But if we go to warp, we should see that adding 1000 to this user ID's cart is a thing that is run. Now let's test to see what happens if we don't do that. So if we just go to our middleware here and we set this to a public route. So now we have a public route. We can go ahead and sign out by just tossing the user button back on the page. So we can just do user button and hit save. Now we should be able to refresh. What are you complaining? Oh, you're complaining because let's put this here and then we'll do one of these bad boys. We'll just put a fragment on the page. So it has a top level. And now if we refresh, here is my button. If I sign out, I'm signed out because this is a public route now. We just added it to middleware. If we click this button now, you get this error message. You must be logged in because I threw this error message on purpose, but obviously you could handle this however you wanted. So that's just one way of using server actions, which is server to server in a single place. But another feature is being able to use this in a client aspect. So you have a server action that lives on the server, but you can call this from a client, which is kind of scary and weird and still trying to wrap my hand around it, but it's awesome. So what we can do here is make this a different action altogether, and we can export these out. Now, this is where the caveat lies. So part of the problem with using this today is in our docs, which we explain in server action section. We go to server actions and we scroll down and we go to here with client components. When you use a client component, you need to make sure you're prop drilling to ensure that headers are available, because Clerk needs the header from our application to be able to do these kinds of things. So I have this right here. Let me just grab this server action and we're going to put it in our actions here. So let's call this actions.actions.tss. And inside of here, all we're doing is checking and throwing an error to say that you must be signed in. And here is the form data. Then from here, we have a server page, which sounds a bit weird, but all we're doing is importing this action and then passing it through. So if I copy this and put it in our server page, like so. So now we have this imported. We have this, which is expecting a UI on this page, which we don't have yet, but we're also importing this. So let's just make sure we're importing the right thing. So it's underscore actions/actions here. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the client component, and the client component is the actual form that the user wants to use. So if we grab this and we go into our app and we create a new file here, and we'll call it UI.tsx, and we drop this in and hit save. Ignore the TypeScript error. Now you'll see that this is all happy and satisfied. And if we go back to our application here, we should see that there's an add to cart and a thing here, so we can just do testing. Apparently it's white text for some reason. If I click add to cart, it says you must be signed in to use this thing. So we've done the same thing, but now we're using it in a client component. Now, if I go ahead and go back to our UI here, and let's just see class name, BG, yeah, whatever you want to give me, that looks good to me. Hit save. Okay, now we have this. Nope, that's still not good. We need this to be like 800. Okay, so now we have this button up here, and if we click it again, obviously you can see you need to be signed in. But if we go ahead and sign into our application, and we can do that by just going to localhost 3000/sign-in, which will allow me to sign in again. So if I sign in with my GitHub account, I'll get redirected back here. And if I click add to cart now, you can see there's no error message. And if I go to my warp, you'll see that this has happened. And here is the data from the form action itself. It has an action ID of this. And here is the values that we were passing in. Obviously right here, it's just complaining because I don't have probably a value. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I provided a value prop to the form field without an on-change handler, which is perfectly fine because we don't actually care about this in the example. We have a value of equal to test, but no on-change handler. But the idea here is this is a client component, which then holds the page here, which returns just this client component. So this is still a server component, but it's holding a client component. And our action here is obviously a server action. So there you have it, authentication with App Router using server components, route handlers, server actions. If you did enjoy this video, of course, make sure to drop it a like. If you haven't subscribed, click right here, little button, click it, subscribe if you haven't already. And of course, if you haven't watched any of my other videos, click right here. Something algorithm driven, I guarantee you'll enjoy it.